et bonsoir tout le monde. C'est un plaisir pour moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue dans cette séance pour commémorer les 40 ans de la Charte africaine en mémoire de Prof. Professeur Heyns. On aura la troisième panel pendant les heures qui suivent et le premier présenteur est M. Philippe Oamen. Monsieur Philippe Oamen présentera un papier écrit par lui-même et Monsieur Egosa Ekator sur l'impact du COVID-19 sur les droits socio-économiques des personnes âgées en Afrique, l'urgence d'opérationnaliser le protocole africain relatif aux personnes âgées. Monsieur Philippe Oamen est doctorant et enseignant associé à l'école de droit de l'Université de Birmingham, au Royaume-Uni, où il enseigne le droit public. Il est également chargé de cours invité à la Birmingham City University, où il enseigne le droit des contrats et le droit des sociétés. Monsieur Philippe, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. S'il vous plaît, parlez lentement pour qu'on puisse faire l'interprétation proprement. Vous avez 15 minutes. Quand vos 15 minutes sont écoulées, je vais vous faire savoir.
Oh, sorry, I could not. I only heard French. I didn't hear you speak English, so I was surprised. Though
Okay.
my system shows that it is English, I heard you speaking French.
Okay, maybe before we start, let us just check with our technical team. Tiruna, can you please let us know if translation is working?
Good afternoon, everyone. So we have a dual language function available for our conference today. So at the bottom of your screen on your control panel, you should see the option for interpretation, and you can select the channel that you will be using. So I would advise that all English speaking participants select the English channel, and you have the option of muting the original audio in order to ensure that you don't get any mic feedback.
Thank you very much, Tiruna. But just for your sake, Mr. Philip, I was just introducing you and I was telling you to please space yourself while speaking so that our interpreters can interpret what you're saying properly. And you'll have 15 minutes. Once the 15 minutes are over, I will let you know. Please, you can start with your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It is my pleasure to be here. And I am presenting on the impact of socioeconomic rights on older persons in Africa, the urgency of operationalizing the protocol on the rights of older persons in Africa. And it is a paper I co-author with a colleague, Rosa, who is here with us. So I will try as much as possible to keep to the time. I want to thank the organizers of the program. In the course of this paper, we will be looking at the meaning of older persons. What does it mean? So we need to unpack who they are before we can determine whether or not they have rights in law. Then we also consider the economic and social rights of older persons in Africa, the impact that COVID-19 has had on those rights. Then we make our conclusion and recommendations. So the COVID-19 has actually revealed the pathetic situation around older persons across the world. So in this paper, we're going to particularly focus on the socio-economic rights of these persons, though civil and political rights have also been adversely affected by the COVID-19. Our focus will be on economic and social rights. So when we say economic and social rights, we're talking about the welfare rights to minimum condition for welfare and well-being of people.
Monsieur Philippe,
Hello?
sorry to disturb you, Mr. Philippe, but we just got a question that there's no interpretation in French. Can we please confirm that this has been sorted?
From me?
No, not for you,
Okay.
but participants mentioned that there's no, maybe let's wait about 2 minutes. Tiruna says they are contacting the interpreter. Sorry about this, Mr. Patrick.
That's fine. It's
Sorry.
okay.
These are the challenges we face in the virtual world,
Yes,
unfortunately.
it's understandable. Yeah, I can hear you.
So we'll just wait for 2 or 3
Sorted.
minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, for the translation to be sorted out. Pour les francophones, on attend 2 ou 3 minutes
Yes.
pour qu'on puisse travailler sur l'interprétation.
All right. Should I continue?
Just 1 second, Mr. Philip, please. Tiruna,
Yes.
have we sorted the interpretation issue? Okay, we can continue, Mr. Philip. Thank you very much. Apologies for the interruption.
That's all right. Thank you. So, as I was saying, the COVID-19 has put the older persons in a very terrible situation because they have been neglected as a result of the impact of COVID-19. But we need to take the matter seriously, considering the fact that reports from the United Nations suggest that the older persons are now more in number than any other age group across the world. In 2019, the United Nations reports stated that for the very first time in history, in 2018, the older persons doubled the number of persons who were under 5 years. That's the older persons were more than children. And the report also suggests or projects that by 2050, the number of older persons across the world will also double. And that also affects Africa. Before now, the position was that Africa is a youthful continent. But that particular report has suggested that by 2050, more than 250 million persons will fall into the category of older persons. So what does that mean for us as far as human rights is concerned? So we're going to look at it critically with a view to seeing how we can protect the future of these species, while also looking at how the pandemic has affected them. It is important to establish the fact that at the moment, there is no single treaty at the global level that recognizes the rights of older persons as specific rights. They have not been specifically addressed, as we have the one for children and for women. The challenge of that is that it is a time bomb. The human rights architecture at the moment is in protection of children and women. These children one day will become older. If there is no particular framework to protect them, if the attention, the deserved traction is not given to this set of persons, then when the younger people become older, then there will be a problem across the world. So there should be a mainstreaming of aging into development processes across the world, especially in Africa, where we have endemic poverty and systemic failures at the moment. So who is an old person? There is no universally agreed definition of the term older persons, but the protocol, that is the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of older persons, defines older persons as persons who are age 60 and above, as defined by the United Nations. So this particular protocol refers to the United Nations, but the United Nations approach is that it looks at old age from the point of view of retirement. It looks at it from the point of view that somebody who has retired is an older person. But there is a problem with that as far as the African continent is concerned. That is a westernized approach to defining age, because many persons, according to the United Nations International Labour Organization, many persons in Africa who are older are working in the informal sector where retirement issue does not arise. So if you say somebody is old because they have retired, that simply means that you have removed or secluded so many persons who should have been captured as far as the African continent is concerned. That is why government has suggested that there should be a distinction between how you define old age in the developing world and how you define it in the developed world, because the social construct is different. The factors that will affect a person in the developing world is not the same that will affect those in the developed world. So the Western chronological approach to defining age is not what we should adopt in Africa. We should look at the social context, the local context in Africa, in order to arrive at who another person is. So what are the rights, socioeconomic rights of these persons that are affected? Sorry, can I confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, we can, Mr. Philip.
All right, thank you. Now, the right to equality and not discrimination. One will say that, yeah, this is not an economic and social right properly so called, but it is a right that intersects with virtually every right. Now, there are so many normative framing around the right to economic right as it relates to equality. For example, Article 3 of the International Conférence on Economic and Social Rights. We also have the African Charter. And more fundamentally, for my own argument here, is the General Comment number 6 of the Committee on Economic and Social Rights of the Economic and Social Rights. So these particular provisions provide that older persons should be given equal opportunity, just like every other person in the other groupings. But that has not been done, as we will soon see when we discuss the impact. The right to work, every older person is entitled to opportunity to work, to choose the particular work they want to do, and to work in a just and favorable condition. This has also been given some human rights recognition. There are so many instruments that recognize it. For example, Article 6 and 7 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. There is the Older Persons Protocol and so many other ones. The right to social security. This right states that the older persons should be entitled to pension, and those who are not working in the formal sector should also be entitled to social benefits. There should be some social benefit safety or safety nets to protect them against loss of jobs and means of sustenance. Then we have the right to health. older persons have a right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This right has been specifically provided for under Article 15 of the Protocol on the Rights of Older Persons in Africa. It provides that it is not enough for you to provide or recognize the right to health, that such rights to health should also consider the geriatrics and gerontology in training of healthcare personnel. That if you want to take people for training, you should consider whether the special needs of the older persons will be taken care of by that training. In part, what has COVID-19 done to remove or attenuate these particular rights in Africa? Now, on the right to work, the COVID-19 has removed work from so many persons who fall under the ages of older persons. According to the International Labour Organization, 56% of African older men and 33% of African women, older women, are working in Africa. They are part of the workforce. That means, though they are old, they are still very active. Now, COVID-19 has impacted on that right gravely. The lockdown across the world or across Africa reduced economic activities, making it difficult for this set of persons to earn a living. Somebody was interviewed in Kenya, and look at what they said. They said, as a shoemaker, before COVID-19, I could receive as high as 500 shillings a day, but now I hardly take home any money. That was because of the lockdown. Another one was interviewed, and he said, our income went down since some of my sons who support the household financially lost their employment. So it has a direct and indirect impact. It is either it's taking away the job of older persons, or it is taking away the job of those persons on whom they depend, their sons, and their doctors. On the right to health, the United Nations has observed that the social isolation across the world has actually worsened the health situation of older persons, because attention was taken away from them to those persons who became COVID-19 patients. Apart from the fact that they could not access medical facilities, the restriction in terms of movement also worsened their health situation, because there was no longer any physical or social gathering, which has some emotional and psychological benefit. So it kind of brought about issues around mental health. So a report was recently released, and it states that the level of satisfaction regarding the family relationship with older persons and their family members dropped from 60% before COVID-19 to 40% after COVID-19, leading to their emotional and psychological problems. Then the digital poverty in Africa among the older persons also worsened the situation. The only major way of connecting during the COVID-19 lockdown was through the internet interaction and all that. But because those persons could not access the internet as a result of digital poverty, that again aggravated their mental health situations. On the right to equality, the older persons were spotlighted by COVID-19, no doubt. But the spotlighting did not bring in any positive results. It rather worsened their situations. Say older people should stay at home because they have a peculiar chance of, or more chances of catch the pandemic. But again, they became the subject of discriminatory practices. An example we'll cite is the case from the Philippines. A president, a city president of a country, was reported to have said that the vaccine should be given to those persons who have a chance of contributing to the society productively. That most of the senior citizens are no longer as active and productive, so they should be disposed of. That was a statement from the president. But like we argue in the May paper we submitted, older persons are not disposable. They are not dispensable. Human rights do not expire with old age. The fact that they have become old does not mean that they should sit at the back. They should be considered as part and parcel of human beings as far as human rights protection is concerned. So ageism should not come in, and they should not become object of commodification. Then what will be the way out of this? We have mentioned some ways to address the issue around older persons who the United Nations has described as chronically invisible. We need to move them from their chronic invisibility to the spotlight in terms of giving them the particular rights they deserve. How do we go about that? There should be an international and regional cooperation. The African countries should explore and exploit the normative framework around international cooperation. We need to establish the fact that when Africa seeks and obtains benefits or assistance from the developed world, it should not be seen as if we are being entitled. Some scholars will say that is entitlement mentality, but there is a normative framing around it as far as economic and social rights is concerned. For example, Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights expressly provides that realizing the provisions of that particular covenant is not what an individual country can do, that the developed countries should assist the developing countries. And of course, that has to do with the historical underpinning of the United Nations human rights system. The systemic effect, the way the international law was constructed in order to project the West against the rest. If I may borrow the words of Professor Carfor, it is the time to center the rest rather than the West. So the international cooperation we're talking about is that the particular countries, the developed, the global north, should pay particular attention to what is happening in the global south by making economic and technical assistance available to those countries. And when Africa seeks such, they should not be seen as persons asking for charity. It is a matter related to rights. Then there should also be an adoption of an international convention on the rights of older persons, just as we have it for the children, for women, and all that. It is true that there is already soft laws, a lot of soft laws that can be used to galvanize the protection of these persons. But it is better to have a specific international framework for them. And the international convention should be adopted to address their concerns. There should be ratification and operationalization of the protocol by African states. As I speak to you, only 3 countries, Lesotho, Ethiopia, and Benin, have ratified the African protocol on older persons. But it requires 50 African countries for it to come into place. So it is a call for every other country in Africa to adopt it, to ratify it, and then operationalize it. In terms of operationalization, we are talking of localizing it. Let there be a domestic law across Africa countries that addresses the socioeconomic rights of older persons. Let there be a particular unit within within the African Union that is solely devoted to addressing issues around older persons. The human rights institutions of all the countries in Africa should devote a particular unit or division towards addressing issues around older persons. There should be a judicial approach that is liberal in nature. The African Court on Human Rights, the national courts should be they should be pro older persons. They should take decisions that are in favor of older persons. They should borrow from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as we argue in our full paper. In the case of Bullitt and Chile, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights clearly stated that older persons are entitled to right to health. We look forward to seeing such vibrant and liberal judicial approach within the African community. There should also be a genuine political way towards the implementation of the Abuja Declaration, which states that at least 15% of every budget among members of the African Union should be devoted to healthcare. But this is, of course, not what is obtainable at the moment. Many African countries devote 2, 3, 5% of their annual budget to healthcare. This should not be. Involvement of older persons. Older persons should be involved in the formulation and implementation of policies around aging. They should be brought to the table. Let them be in the station at a discussion table so that any outcome that will be implemented by the states will be an evolved outcome, an outcome that has gone through all the collaborative networks. So to conclude, I don't know, do I still have time?
Time is over, Mr. Phillips. So if you can have 30 seconds to just wrap up.
All right. To conclude, I will simply remind us of what Kofi Annan once said concerning aging. He stated that we are facing a critical situation, that there is a time bomb. To use his particular word, he said there is a silent, that we are in the midst of a silent revolution, which will bring about economic, spiritual, and psychological effect because of the way aging is going, because older persons are becoming more and more across the world. If the issue is not addressed now, then it will lead to a problem of implosion and explosion at the end of the day. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering the questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Philippe, pour avoir mis l'accent sur ce sujet vraiment important, surtout sur un groupe qui est toujours oublié. Et dans le contexte de COVID-19, on a vu qu'il y a beaucoup de violations des droits des personnes âgées. Donc, maintenant est le temps pour les États de montrer leur obligation envers les personnes âgées, de ratifier le protocole sur les personnes âgées en Afrique. Donc, notre second panéliste est M. Ousmane Nouakchott, qui nous fera une présentation de son papier titulé « L'Union africaine et la protection du droit à la santé en temps de crise sanitaire COVID-19, dispositifs, stratégies et contraintes d'action ». Monsieur Ousmanou est docteur en sciences politiques et enseignant permanent à l'Institut des relations internationales du Cameroun. Il est aussi chercheur au Clécide de Lyon en France et au Carpates de Montréal au Canada. Soyez le bienvenu, Monsieur Ousmanou. Veuillez parler lentement pour les interpréteurs et vous avez 15 minutes pour la présentation. Merci beaucoup.
Je vous remercie, Madame Boudot. Je voudrais me joindre à l'ensemble de ceux qui m'ont précédé pour saluer l'initiative et féliciter les organisateurs de cette journée de réflexion en l'hommage du professeur Heyns. J'ai voulu qu'on échange sur la capacité de l'Union africaine à protéger le droit à la santé pour les citoyens d'Afrique en partant de ce que j'ai pu constater pendant la pandémie du coronavirus. Alors, je commencerai par distinguer le droit à la santé du droit à la bonne santé, puisque ce second volet s'entend de la possibilité que se donnent des individus de s'offrir la santé à la mesure de leurs moyens. Mais le droit à la santé est basiquement entendu comme la faculté qu'ont les citoyens, indistinctement de leur statut, à accéder à un niveau minimal de santé pour pouvoir vivre logiquement dans la société. J'ai eu des panélistes avant moi, Madame, je pense bien que je prononce, Madame Ouaro, qui en a parlé, et Ebenezer, et bien entendu tout à l'heure, Philippe en parlait un tout petit peu pour les personnes âgées. Alors, ce droit comprend la possibilité d'accéder à des soins de santé de façon régulière, sans discontinuité, une fois que le besoin s'impose. Cela suppose qu'il faut une disponibilité d'infrastructures, il faut une disponibilité de personnel, mais il faut également une disponibilité de médicaments pour prodiguer des soins de santé à des personnes. Bien entendu, la santé sera entendue beaucoup plus large. Au-delà de la santé comme malaise physique, elle est également mentale et psychologique. Alors, parler du droit à la santé et le rapprocher à l'Union africaine peut paraître paradoxal parce que basiquement, le droit à la santé est l'œuvre, je veux dire, ressort de la compétence des États. Il appartient à chaque État d'organiser un système de santé pour permettre à ses citoyens d'avoir, bien entendu, accès à la santé, je veux dire, à des soins de santé, si le besoin s'en imposait. Alors, ce droit a été perturbé pendant la pandémie de COVID-19 pour une simple raison que cette pandémie, sa violence sur les sociétés, sur les structures humaines, la brutalité avec laquelle elle est arrivée a imposé que des sociétés humaines, des États, s'organisent par des mesures drastiques, allant parfois même contre les libertés individuelles que globalement tous les États acceptent et l'Union africaine elle-même promeut, bien entendu, à travers la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme. Alors, je me suis interrogé au regard des mesures qui ont été adoptées pendant la pandémie de coronavirus, fermeture des frontières, imposition de masques aux populations, fermeture de services publics, privés, couvre-feu, confinement. Qu'est-ce qu'il restera ou alors qu'est-ce qu'il en est resté du droit à la santé? Parce que l'accès à la santé a également été perturbé par un discours contradictoire entre parfois des scientifiques et les hommes politiques, où il n'y avait pas de thérapie sûre pour combattre le coronavirus, ce qui a créé un sentiment de méfiance vis-à-vis de toutes les mesures qui étaient prises. Alors, ce droit a été perturbé, soit du fait de l'action autoritaire de l'État, soit simplement de la méfiance des citoyens eux-mêmes qui n'ont pas souhaité aller dans des structures de santé, estimant parfois que c'était le chemin direct pour la mort. Alors, comment l'Union africaine réussit donc à coordonner une action collective au niveau régional étant donné que les États et la pandémie de coronavirus a démontré que l'action individuelle de chaque État ne pouvait pas venir à bout d'une maladie, d'une pandémie comme celle qu'on a vécue. Il appartient donc aux organisations internationales du calibre de l'Union africaine de prendre à sa charge, de jouer sa responsabilité, son leadership pour coordonner, pour impulser une certaine diplomatie sanitaire qui va consister à coordonner l'action collective des États d'Afrique et faciliter, je veux dire, empêcher la rupture dans la fourniture des soins de santé à la population. Alors, je voudrais présenter ma réflexion à partir de, je veux dire, sur 3 points. Le premier point va consister à dire d'abord ce que le droit de la santé, je veux dire comment l'Union africaine encadre le droit à la santé. Comment l'Union africaine encadre le droit à la santé. Ça veut dire qu'il faudra, bien entendu, revenir sur son contenu matériel, de dire quelles sont les règles juridiques et les mesures institutionnelles que l'Union africaine mobilise pour faciliter, pour accompagner les États et les citoyens dans la jouissance et dans l'accès à la santé dans leurs États respectifs. Le deuxième point sera axé sur l'analyse même de la riposte continentale au COVID-19 et le sort qui a été réservé au droit à la santé dans cette période précise. Et un troisième point va revenir sur ce que j'ai nommé les dilemmes perpétuels du droit à la santé dans nos États tel qu'il est apparu de la lutte contre le coronavirus. Sur le premier point, quel dispositif juridique, quelles règles de droit encadrent le droit à la santé? Parce que finalement, on va se rendre compte que l'Union africaine a fait du droit à la santé un droit comme tous les autres. Et donc, si c'est un droit comme tous les autres, et c'est M. Job qui en parlait, quelle est la capacité des citoyens à réclamer la jouissance de ce droit auprès de leurs États? Ou alors, quelle est la possibilité pour l'Union africaine, pour la Commission des droits de l'homme, la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme, de demander l'application de ce droit et quelles peuvent en être les modalités d'application? Parce que c'est très bien de proclamer un droit, mais c'est encore mieux de le faire bénéficier aux destinataires. Alors, l'Union africaine, à partir de sa charte, la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme, l'Union africaine, aux articles 14, mais davantage aux articles 16 et 18, parle de la santé. Elle parle de la santé, cette charte-là est définie pour ce qui est notamment de l'article 18, qui pose la question de la santé comme la charte dispose que toute personne a le droit de jouir du meilleur état de santé, physique et mental, qu'elle soit capable d'atteindre. Toute personne a le droit de jouir du meilleur état physique, de santé physique et mentale qu'elle soit capable d'atteindre. Et la charte met cette responsabilité à la charge des États parties qui prennent l'engagement de prendre des mesures nécessaires pour protéger la santé de leur population en leur assurant plutôt l'assistance médicale en cas de maladie. Et quand on avance dans la lecture de la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme, l'article 18 fait un cas spécifique en étendant la compréhension du droit à la santé à des catégories particulières. Parce que là-bas, l'alinéa 1 de cet article pose clairement le droit de la santé plutôt au niveau de la famille, puisque c'est cette famille-là qui est l'élément naturel et la base de la société. Et cette famille doit donc, selon la charte, être protégée par l'État, qui doit veiller à sa santé physique et morale. La santé physique et morale de la famille, puisque c'est elle le socle de la société. Et dans le même article, l'alinéa 4 précise que les personnes âgées ou handicapées ont également droit à des mesures spécifiques de protection en rapport avec leurs besoins physiques et moraux. Voilà donc, le droit à la santé est déjà bien établi dans la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme. Mais quand on fait le passage de l'OUA à l'Union africaine en 2000, la Charte africaine, je veux dire l'acte constitutif de l'Union africaine, va tenir compte des nouvelles réalités de la mondialisation et renforcer cette protection, cette consécration du droit à la santé en l'inscrivant parmi les objectifs de l'organisation continentale. Et à l'article 3, alinéa N, l'un des objectifs de l'Union africaine se trouve donc être d'œuvrer de concert avec les partenaires internationaux pertinents en vue de l'éradication des maladies évitables et de la promotion de la santé sur le continent. Voilà deux textes qui posent de façon tout à fait claire le droit à la santé pour les citoyens d'Afrique. Et tous les États qui ratifient, bien entendu, les 54 qui ratifient l'acte constitutif, sont tenus de respecter cela une fois qu'ils l'ont incorporé dans leurs dispositifs normatifs nationaux. Dans les deux cas, on se rend compte que c'est une responsabilité en réalité que l'Union africaine prend d'impulser une dynamique de protection du droit à la santé en faveur. Mais ce droit à la santé, à partir des éléments et des dispositions que nous venons de lire, a certains critères, parce que ce n'est pas un droit tout à fait comme les autres. Il est un droit, certes, universel, ça c'est l'un de ses critères, parce qu'il ne concerne pas, il ne s'applique pas en fonction des catégories. Il est un droit qui s'applique sans discrimination, ni de race, ni de culture, ni de religion, ni de sexe, ni d'opinion politique. C'est également un droit qui est un droit variable, pour une simple raison qu'il sera adapté. Il sera adapté à la situation à des catégories de personnes. Donc, les États ont l'obligation de prendre des dispositions matérielles et logistiques particulières pour des personnes handicapées, pour des personnes à mobilité réduite. Donc, ça, c'est donc pour adapter le droit à la santé en fonction de la situation de chaque personne. Mais ce droit est à la fois collectif et individuel. Et c'est aussi ça le génie de l'Union africaine, parce qu'on enlève le droit à la santé au seul niveau individuel pour rendre la collectivité responsable de la protection de la santé. Et la situation que nous avons vécue avec le coronavirus montre justement qu'il est important de dépasser le niveau individuel de compréhension du droit à la santé pour l'intégrer dans un cadre beaucoup plus collectif, beaucoup plus large. C'est un droit qui repose sur une obligation de moyens et non de résultats. C'est-à-dire que les États n'ont pas l'obligation d'atteindre la guérison pour le citoyen, curieusement. Mais je pense que c'est un principe de réalité. Ils ont obligé de vous procurer les soins, le maximum de soins possible. Mais s'il arrive que vous ne guérissez pas, là, la philosophie de la Charte ne rend pas l'État responsable de votre non-guérison. Ça veut dire que l'État ne se limite qu'à la procuration des moyens de santé, des mécanismes de santé pour que les populations puissent bénéficier en tant que de besoins. Alors, on peut prolonger cette consécration des textes de l'Union africaine en matière de droit à la santé avec un texte qui a été évoqué ce matin, c'est le pacte, comment le dire, c'est l'article 12 précisément l'article 12 du pacte international relatif aux droits sociaux, économiques et culturels. Ce pacte, qui est reconnu par la plupart, sinon tous les États d'Afrique, précise que les États partis reconnaissent le droit qu'à toute personne de jouir du meilleur état de santé physique et mentale qu'elle soit capable d'atteindre. Et les mesures que les États partis au présent pacte prendront en vue d'assurer le plein exercice de ce droit devront comprendre des mesures nécessaires pour assurer la prophylaxie et le traitement des maladies épidémiques, endémiques, professionnelles et autres. Ça, c'est des dispositions qui sont assez claires pour démontrer que le droit à la santé est quelque chose de déjà encadré par l'Union africaine. Mais au-delà de cet encadrement juridique, on s'est aperçu que l'Union africaine ne s'est pas limitée au texte. L'Union africaine a pris quand même, avec timidité bien entendu, mais a pris quand même des mesures pour disposer d'institutions capables de garantir l'accès à la santé à ces populations. Il y a deux niveaux de réflexion à ce niveau. Le premier niveau est un niveau politique. Et ce niveau a été amplifié avec la crise que nous avons connue. C'est un niveau qui est porté par la Commission de l'Union africaine et la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme. Ces deux organismes jouent le leadership en termes de diplomatie des droits de l'homme. Et à ce titre-là, le droit à la santé fait partie justement de leurs chevaux de bataille qu'ils peuvent bien entendu défendre en faveur des populations des États d'Afrique. Mais au-delà de cette diplomatie de la santé que ces deux organes vont porter, l'Union africaine dispose désormais, depuis notamment 2016, d'un organe technique. Un organe technique qui est le Centre africain de contrôle des maladies. Ce centre a été adopté, je veux dire décidé sa création en 1996 et sa mise en place remonte à l'année 2017. Le Centre africain de contrôle des maladies, CDC, Africa CDC, va fonctionner donc sur un certain nombre de principes d'efficacité, d'appropriation, de crédibilité et de délégation de pouvoir. Donc, il y a un processus quasiment de décentralisation à ce niveau pour que les centres régionaux sur lesquels ce centre va s'appuyer soient le plus proche possible des populations qui vont bénéficier de ces actions. L'Union africaine a donc mis en place 5 centres sous-régionaux pour couvrir toute l'Afrique de ce dispositif technique de promotion et de protection du droit à la santé. On en a un en Afrique de l'Ouest, on en a au Nigeria, bien sûr, on en a en Afrique centrale au Gabon, en Afrique du Nord en Égypte, en Afrique de l'Est au Kenya et en Afrique australe en Zambie. Voilà. Ces centres ont pour objectif de travailler sur des mécanismes de protection et de prévention des maladies à l'avenir. La conjugaison de ces actions, les actions politiques, la diplomatie politique de l'Union africaine et l'action technique du CDC vise à démontrer qu'au niveau régional, l'Union africaine inscrit la santé dans des objets majeurs de sa politique.
Monsieur Ousmane, vous avez une minute pour conclure.
Une minute pour conclure. Alors, dans le deuxième cas, donc, pendant le coronavirus, ce que nous avons, la pandémie de coronavirus, ce que nous avons observé, c'est que l'Union africaine, pour garantir l'égal accès à la santé pour ces populations, a procédé à 2 types de mesures. Des mesures d'urgence qui ont été adoptées et des mesures à long terme. Les mesures d'urgence ont déjà été citées par le passé au niveau des États. C'était d'accompagner et d'accepter la violation momentanée au nom de l'intérêt collectif des droits de l'homme, les confinements et autres. Mais les mesures à long terme, elles, sont beaucoup plus pertinentes. C'est des mesures telles que la création justement des centres, je veux dire la prévision d'une création de 5 centres sous-régionaux de production et de recherche sur les vaccins. Question de sortir l'Afrique de la dépendance internationale en la matière. Mais également, l'Union africaine a beaucoup travaillé avec l'OMS et les Nations unies pour faciliter ce qu'on a appelé la facilité COVAX, la mise à disposition au niveau des États africains des vaccins à des coûts assez accessibles. Mais au-delà de ces actions, le droit à la santé, et on l'a noté, reste balancé entre deux logiques. D'une part, c'est un droit qui est balancé entre la responsabilité collective et la souveraineté nationale. Au nom de l'État, je veux dire, au nom de la responsabilité collective, l'Union africaine peut-elle imposer une démarche aux États en matière de santé au détriment de leur souveraineté nationale? Ou alors les États peuvent-ils prévaloir leur souveraineté nationale contre la responsabilité collective en matière de protection du droit? Ça, c'est une question qu'un précédent panéliste a déjà traitée. Le deuxième paradoxe de ce droit, c'est justement que le droit à la santé a subi un pilotage autoritaire, où on a vu des policiers militaires et autres, ou alors des mesures telles que les couvre-feux, être imposées aux citoyens contre la liberté individuelle. Et en même temps, est-ce que la liberté individuelle autorise un citoyen à fuir l'accès à la santé par peur? On a vu des gens qui ont dit « nous ne prendrons pas le vaccin ». Avez-vous le droit de refuser le vaccin quand on sait que la maladie pourrait être repoussée par cela? C'est autant de paradoxes qui constituent le droit à la santé. Et je vais m'arrêter à ce niveau en vous disant, par exemple, que des questions demeurent. Et le plus important est de comprendre que la pandémie de COVID-19 a suscité un besoin d'un multilatéralisme sanitaire beaucoup plus important pour l'Union africaine, et les États sont invités à accompagner et adhérer à la philosophie collective au niveau de l'Union africaine. Parce que des questions telles que la couverture médicale universelle vont être posées. Comment pouvons-nous garantir l'accès à la santé minimale pour tous les citoyens? Des questions telles que les packages de santé. Quels soins peuvent être prodigués à des populations de façon gratuite sur l'ensemble du continent? C'est aussi une possibilité qu'il faudra voir. Et même, comment peut-on revendiquer ce droit au niveau des tribunaux? C'est la question de la justiciabilité du droit à la santé. Et à quelle catégorie va-t-on ranger ce droit-là et comment pouvons-nous le revendiquer? Quelle condamnation possible? Est-ce que la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme peut être saisie pour accompagner des citoyens et donner des recommandations auprès des États en la matière? C'est des questions que l'Afrique à venir va se poser. Et ça sera donc une modalité de reconceptualisation de la notion de souveraineté au profit des peuples et non plus seulement des États. Je vais m'arrêter là, Madame Boudot, et je vous remercie et remercie les autres panélistes pour leur attention.
On vous remercie pour votre présentation, Monsieur Ousmanou, et pour avoir souligné le rôle de l'Union africaine et non pas des États dans la protection du droit à la santé. Si les participants ont des questions, veuillez les poser à travers la fonction questions et réponses qui se trouve au bas de l'écran. Donc, notre prochaine présentation est sur l'évolution du contre-rapport en tant qu'outil pour avancer les droits des femmes. Et la personne qui fera la présentation est Madame Osaï Ojigo, qui est avocate, experte en droits humains, défenseuse de l'égalité des sexes et leader de la société civile. Elle a été admise au barreau nigérien en 2000 et a obtenu un diplôme de pratique en droits humains internationaux du College of Law d'Angleterre du Pays de Galles en 2010. Soyez la bienvenue, Madame Osaï. Madame Osaï,
thank you very
merci.
Yes, thank you very much, and good day to everyone. Really a pleasure to be joining you today. Just a minute. So really a pleasure to be joining you today on the auspicious occasion commemorating 40 years of the African Charter. So I will be reflecting and sharing on the evolution of the Shadow Report as a tool for advancing women's human rights. Women's rights groups and activists are increasingly using the opportunity of the state reporting mechanism provided in Article 62 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights to submit shadow reports to the African Commission to address poor implementation of international treaties and lack of effective gender-sensitive measures to improve the lives of women and girls in several African countries. Women's human rights as a distinct body of rights was largely hidden in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Article 18.3, which provides that the state shall ensure the elimination of every form of discrimination against women and also ensure the protection of the rights of the woman and the child as stipulated in international declarations and conventions, was the only provision in the African Charter specifically referring to protection of women's rights. Nearly 22 years after the adoption of the African Charter, a protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa, known as the Maputo Protocol, was adopted in 2003 and came into force in 2005. Despite the articulation of women's human rights in the Maputo Protocol, and the fact that many African countries had ratified CEDAW, that is the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, it appeared uncommon for cases affecting women to be prominent at national and regional levels. For instance, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights for over 30 years of its existence was not seized of any communication on women's rights and did not decide a single communication on women's human rights until the case of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights and Inter-Rights against Egypt in 2011, followed by the case brought by Equality Now and the Egyptian Women Lawyers Association and the Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association against Ethiopia in 2015. There are many reasons why women's rights claimants, women's groups, and gender activists are not bringing cases based on women's human rights instruments before these institutions, mostly around litigation costs and the time required to prepare and prosecute these cases. But these are outside the scope of this current discussion. Instead, we're looking more at the state reporting mechanism and why this appears to be a tool which many women's groups are now exploiting in order to bring the issues of women's rights to the fore. So why state reporting, and is it effective in promoting the rights of women? All African states, except Morocco, that recently rejoined the African Union, has ratified the African Charter. The Charter therefore has universal application across the continent. Article 1 of the African Charter creates an obligation on states parties to recognize the rights, duties, and freedoms enshrined in the Charter, and to undertake to adopt legislative or other measures to give effect to them. To ensure compliance with this provision and obligations arising from it, the Charter creates a reporting system in Article 62, by which state parties update the African Commission every 2 years on implementation of rights and freedoms. The state report therefore serves as a tool to discuss human rights protection in the state under review. It opens the space for constructive dialogue. It provides the basis to monitor a state's compliance to its human rights obligations, and provides a platform for accountability as the process is conducted in public and provides possibilities to follow up with respective states based on information given and concluding observations made. State parties to the African Charter have not been so compliant with the requirements to submit their initial reports and periodic reports. By the end of the year in 2011, only 12 state parties to the African Charter had submitted every periodic report due, and 12 states had never submitted a report. 10 years down the line, in 2021, there has been some improvement, but only in terms of state parties that have never submitted a report, reducing that number to 6. only 11 state parties out of the 54 countries are up to date or will be up to date by the next ordinary session in 2021. That will take place later in the year in 2021. With regards to women's groups' engagement in this process, one of the key things that I looked at was how is the state reporting mechanism facilitating the participation of NGOs, whether they have observer status or not. So the African Commission on Human and People's Rights did develop guidelines for the national periodic reports, but went further in 2009 to improve monitoring of women's rights by also adopting guidelines for state reporting under the Maputo Protocol. The idea was that this would bring the issues of women's rights to the fore, but more importantly, facilitate conversations around issues which are often contentious within the African context. The Maputo Protocol till date has been ratified by 42 African states. Only 16 state parties to this protocol have submitted their state reports in compliance with the guidelines that the African Commission developed in 2009. So these states are Angola, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Lesotho, Malawi, Nigeria, Namibia, Mauritania, Rwanda, Senegal, the Seychelles, the Gambia, Togo, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. As suspected, despite the provisions of these guidelines, it took some time before states started complying with the reporting requirement for women's human rights. It took advocacy of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women and training organized by key NGOs and institutions, including the Center for Human Rights and the Solidarity for African Women's Rights Network, to increase awareness of and provide support for states to increase capacity to report on the Charter and the Maputo Protocol. The guidelines for reporting on the Maputo Protocol prescribes 8 themes that states should report on. These are equality and non-discrimination. Secondly, protection of women from violence. Third, rights related to marriage. Fourth, health and reproductive rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights. Rights to peace. Protection of women in armed conflicts. And rights of specially protected women's groups, for example, widows. From the submission of shadow reports that several human rights groups have submitted, several women's groups and activists have submitted, one will find that they tend to focus a lot on rights that they have specific expertise on. The shadow report, sometimes described as a parallel report or alternative report, is a method for interested parties, institutions, non-governmental organizations to supplement and or present alternative information to reports governments are required to submit under human rights treaties. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has been very receptive to receive shadow reports. In fact, in its updated rules, Rule 79.3 of its Rules of Procedure 2020, it provides that institutions, organizations, or any other interested party wishing to contribute to the examination of the report on the human rights situation in the country concerned shall send their contributions, including shadow reports, to the Secretary at least 30 days prior to the examination of the report. Such contributions should follow the Commission's guidelines on shadow reports as applicable and speak to the actual report. While the rules, in addition, provide that these contributions by interested persons and institutions may be published online on the Commission's website, this has not yet been explored fully by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So in summary, based on many of the reports that have been shared, many women groups who have engaged with the UN system did not find submitting shadow reports to the African Commission an alien exercise. So groups and organizations like the Greek Lake's Initiative for Human Rights and Development, Women in Law and Development in Africa, WILDAF, FEMNET, SOA, FIDA, Alliances for Africa, RAPA, have all facilitated or joined processes that led to the development and submission of shadow reports on specific rights contained in the Maputo Protocol for reports submitted by Rwanda, Togo, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Cameroon, for example. And they tended to focus on rights that they had expertise or of interest to the particular group. One thing that emerged was the fact that the shadow report gave an expanded opportunity for groups interested in women's human rights to actually strengthen the questions that the African Commission would use in order to interrogate the state during the session. So while this is not formally recognized, the feedback is that oftentimes they can see how having the shadow reports prior to the examination of a state report helps to improve the examination of the state. What is still being followed through is how this translates to improvement to women's human rights back in country. One of the opportunities that came out from the study is that the documentation and publication of the state reports online actually helps facilitate participation. It also means in situations where women's groups could have been excluded as a result of lack of resources in order to engage with the Commission, having access to online resources facilitated that participation. However, the shadow reports are not yet online, and therefore it's not easy to see how many groups have submitted, on what issues, and how this has influenced, if at all in any way, the concluding observations that the African Commission has after reviewing the state's report. Despite the fact that there are over 500 NGOs with observer status with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, there isn't any publicly available and accessible information in terms of the thematic areas that they are working on. And there were suggestions that this could be one way through which the African Commission could also actively promote its evaluation of specific issues concerning women's human rights, if it is aware and exploiting all the expertise that NGOs that have observer status with the African Commission can provide to this process. Many of the groups that shared their experience relied a lot on alliance building. Oftentimes, many have not engaged with the African Commission before, but we are fascinated by the fact that when their state representatives come back home, would publicize their participation at the Commission and then share all the laudable things they've done without talking more specifically in terms of the recommendations that have gone on. So alliance building has helped in terms of translating some of those concluding observations into issues which local groups can pick up at country level in order to hold governments to account. But more importantly, to continue to use that as a tool to raise awareness on women's rights and why the country needs to do more in order to make it a lived reality for women. While the obligation to report is on the state and the duty to check and feedback is on the African Commission, the role of NGOs in the process during public sessions where states are examined is merely as observers. However, there's a growing need that there's a lot of benefit in engaging NGOs prior to and after this process in order to have a more comprehensive assessment and feedback in terms of what NGOs also feel, and even people who have been impacted by decisions of governments in their countries can feedback to the Commission. Another area for improvement is around preparation for the state reporting process. In the UN system, there is a circle of reporting that is monitored strictly. So whether a state submits the report or not, a treaty body can still make provision by addressing a list of issues concerning the state and is open to receive shadow reports from others. This makes that process quite predictive. In a system like Africa, where we find that many African countries resist or are constantly delayed in meeting up to their obligations to submit periodic reports, it creates an unnecessary burden on NGOs who would have a very short turnaround time in order to be able to submit shadow reports in time to be considered within the time frame that would be effective for the African Commission. So hoping that a system can be developed in order to make the timetable more predictive and also to call out state parties when they are not in compliance. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Osaï, pour la présentation vraiment compréhensive. Effectivement, les comptes en rapport des organisations société civile sont vraiment importants dans le processus du rapport étatique, surtout concernant la réalisation des droits des femmes en Afrique. Et la Commission africaine et les organisations société civile sont en train de travailler sur des lignes directives pour la préparation des rapports, des contre-rapports au rapport étatique pour qu'on puisse donner plus de direction aux organisations société civile pour la préparation de ces rapports. Merci beaucoup encore une fois. Donc, notre dernière présentation pour cette panel est de Dr. Adane, qui nous parlera de l'action d'adaptation au changement climatique et les droits humains en Afrique. Il mettra l'emphase sur les trajectoires évolutives, synergies et défis potentiels. Dr. Adane est chargé de cours sur la science du changement climatique et de droit à l'Université de l'énergie et de ressources naturelles qui se trouve à Sunyani, Ghana. On vous souhaite la bienvenue, Dr. Makel. Vous avez 15 minutes. Merci.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from Sunyani, Ghana. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for the opportunity to make this presentation as we commemorate 40 years of community resistance of the African Charter. My presentation is going to take a different route because my topic seems to be very different from all the other presentations, but there are interconnections. So my name is Dr. Michael Adani, and I'll be presenting on climate change adaptation action in the African Union. I'll focus on the benefits, as in the trajectories, the pathways, and the potential challenges. I'll be sharing my screen. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will try to give a brief history of the emergence of human rights in the field of climate change adaptation, and also a right-based approach to climate change adaptation in Africa, focusing on the benefits and the key challenges. I also look at the relevant issues as in terms of substantive human rights norms that are applicable in the context of climate change action, and also some of the procedural rights. So climate change as a common concern. Now, there is scientific consensus that global warming is happening and climate change is also occurring. And this has devastating effects on everything that we value, including our very lives, as climate change poses existential threat to humanity. So global warming has emerged as one of the pressing issues on the international and regional agenda in Africa for some time now. We are daily reminded of the extreme events occurring in various parts of Africa, including the popular Day Zero in Cape Town, where they had water scarcity, the locust invasion in East Africa, the flooding in Accra that led to the loss of lives, and of course, the cyclone Idai that took place in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and other East African countries. So climate change is something that we are faced with. And there is scientific consensus that climate change is going to, in fact, intensify in the coming days if we keep having this business as usual without taking drastic measures. So in 1992, the United Nations adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992. And in fact, most countries also joined. And this has been celebrated as as a benchmark. However, there is consensus that if the UN and especially developing countries do not take drastic measures, then countries in the global south, basically developing countries and least developing countries, are going to face severe consequences of climate change. So in fact, the whole Earth is at risk. Usually in climate change cycles, people refer to it as planetary health, because climate change is something that is facing both developed and developing countries. But Africa is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Even though climate change, Africa contributed very negligibly to climate change. So this is the projections is the projection for the scientific community, that in case now we are not able to meet the target set by the Paris Agreement and temperatures increase by 2%, then food production and agricultural production systems are going to be affected. There's going to be failing crop yields in many areas, particularly developing regions, of which Africa is part. And this will lead to possible rising yields in some high latitude countries, while there will be falling yield in many developing countries. And there's going to be also water scarcity and sea level rise that will threaten major cities and coastal regions. And this will also have extensive damage to ecosystem services. So all this point to the fact that climate change poses an existential threat. And in Africa in particular, the Saharan Desert and the Kalahari Desert is rapidly expanding in terms of spatial extent and intensity. And this has the potential of making entire countries not suitable for farming. And in a continent whereby majority of the population rely on rainfed agriculture, this is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. So now the link between climate change and human rights is something that has received serious attention from the academic community. Even though in Africa, most human rights scholars, practitioners, and activists are not talking about this. But there is a general consensus that the effect of climate change is undermining and will continue to undermine the full enjoyment of human rights. This has been asserted by the Human Rights Council in 2015 and also in 2008 and 2009. The Human Rights Council has highlighted that the adverse effects of climate change have a range of implications, both direct and indirect, for the effective enjoyment of human rights, including, among others, the right to life, the right to adequate food, the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to adequate housing, the right to self-determination, the right to safe drinking water, sanitation, and the right to development. And all these rights are very relevant if we want to promote human rights compatible development in Africa. And also, safeguarding human rights in the context of climate action is crucial in advancing inclusive and equitable economic social development, because the adverse effects of climate change poses serious risk to those who are marginalized and living in vulnerable communities, especially forest-dependent people, indigenous people, the urban poor, and the poor people in coastal regions. So if climate action is not undertaken to safeguard human rights, then it means we will fail in realizing the sustainable development goals, especially goal 13, which is taking climate action. Therefore, the SDGs requires the international community and states to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, and to incorporate climate change-related considerations into the SDGs. All these demands that at the continental level, the African Union and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and various treaty monitoring bodies should make conscious effort to integrate climate change in its various policies, declarations, resolutions, and even, if possible, to adapt a treaty to address the existing gaps. So I also discussed the benefit of human rights-based approach to climate change, because there's a serious resistance from especially climate change scholars that climate change should be addressed through scientific means. We shouldn't try to integrate human rights principles and norms into climate change policies and action. So I argue that integrating human rights into climate change action has three benefits. The first one is the human rights approach put vulnerable population at the center of climate change action. And this has the potential of putting additional moral, ethical, as well as legal pressure on states to act decisively in the implementation of adaptation measures. Mostly countries in the global north or developed countries are pushing for scientific interventions like climate engineering and various innovative technologies to address climate change. But these are market-based mechanisms. And at the end of the day, the vulnerable and the poor people will not be able to access some of these technologies. Especially Adaptation made this illustration that while people are building expensive houses that can float, people in Africa and other countries in Asia have to learn how to swim. Because in case of extreme climatic event like flooding, if you're in Africa and you don't know how to swim, then your life will be threatened. So, and human rights law also provide avenues for those affected by climate action to seek remedy. It is well established that climate change do not violate human rights. However, responses to climate change can violate human rights when state parties or countries do not comply with their human rights commitment when undertaking action, either mitigation or adaptation. A human rights-based approach to climate change adaptation can also promote participation of independent mechanisms to monitor implementation of various obligations, because the existing climate change regime is basically political, where conference of parties who are basically ministers of state meet to discuss possible actions to undertake to address climate change. Therefore, when somebody's rights are violated, there is no mechanism for them to seek remedy. But when human rights mechanisms are brought to bear in undertaking climate action, the affected parties can seek remedies at court of competent jurisdiction. So, as I conclude, these are the substantive human rights issues that needs to be addressed in the context of climate change action. Of course, there are a lot of them, but because of time, I'll just focus on three. The first one is right to health, and by extension, the right to life. So one of the most apparent human rights issues is the potential and actual impact of climate change on human health. When there are extreme climatic events like flooding, drought, famine, and even cyclones, people's health are affected because of outbreak of disease like malaria, dysentery, bilharzia, typhoid, dengue fever, and all that. And the African Charter also guarantees the right to health. And state parties cannot excuse themselves, because when they are undertaking any developmental action, they must make sure that it is compatible with their international and regional human rights law. So in the case of the Social and Economic Rights Action Center and Center for Economic and Social Rights versus Nigeria before the African Commission, for instance, the African Commission, in reference to Article 12.2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, acknowledged the link between environment and the right to health by underscoring that environmental degradation is harmful to physical and mental health, and climate change is the worst form of environmental degradation that is known. So the African Commission also observed that states were obliged to conduct appropriate monitoring of the environment, as well as conduct scientific study before commencing any development activities, and to allow meaningful opportunities for individuals to be heard and to participate in decision-making. This requires that when states are undertaking climate action, whether mitigation or adaptation, they should conduct environmental and social impact assessment to make sure that the various potential effects, negative effects, are addressed, and that there is meaningful participation by the affected beneficiaries of such project or development interventions. The next one is the right to adequate standard of living. The right to adequate standard of living is also very pivotal to climate change adaptation action, because climate effects such as drought can adversely impact on agriculture and food production, and that makes worsen the possibility of hunger, especially in the poorest and vulnerable regions in Africa. And also the right to general satisfactory environment, as enshrined in Article 24 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So climate change is a potential trigger to us achieving a generally satisfactory environment that is favorable to people's development. For instance, in the Ogoni case, the African Commission unequivocally recognized a link between a clean and safe environment and the quality of life and safety of individuals. But climate change poses serious threat to the realization of all this. So without the integration of climate change integration of human rights norms, procedures, and values into climate change interventions, these rights will be undermined when states are undertaking climate change action. And for instance, the African Commission also underscored or clarified that states must take reasonable measures to prevent pollution and ecological degradation, to promote conservation and to secure an ecologically sustainable development and the use of natural resources. Achieving ecologically sustainable development is not possible until states undertake climate action that is inclusive to address various sustainable development challenges, including the fulfillment or enjoyment of fundamental human rights. So I argue that the reason of the African Commission is advantageous for climate change, as it can be addressed under the general category of the right to environment without the need to rely on other related rights, such as the right to health and adequate standard of living. In conclusion, human rights law offers an additional avenue to encourage states in addressing the adverse effect of climate change. Human rights law does not replace or serve as a substitution for regional climate change laws, but rather it complements and strengthens them in terms of making them effective for action. So human rights principles and norms relating to climate change adaptation at a very early stage of development in Africa, and therefore scholars, various human rights institutions and activists should make sure that at least human rights receives attention when states are undertaking climate action, as it has received attention in the inter-American system and even in Europe, the popular case of Uganda and others. So thank you very much. I'm waiting for questions.
On vous remercie pour votre présentation, Dr. Michael. Effectivement, on a besoin d'adopter une approche des droits humains face aux problèmes de changement climatique qu'on fait. On est maintenant à la fin de la troisième panel de cette journée. On remercie tous les présentateurs, les présentatrices pour leur présentation et pour nous avoir donné des pensées, pour nous avoir fait penser sur les différents aspects de la Charte africaine ou quand on est en train de célébrer ses 40 ans. On vous remercie pour votre présentation. On peut prendre une pause de 5 minutes avant qu'on reprenne avec la prochaine panel. Merci.